When the US and Canada came together 50 years ago to sign the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, it altered a terrible trajectory of pollution and environmental degradation. It also bound both countries to an active stewardship of the lakes. With us now to consider whether Canada is doing enough to hold up its side of the bargain. In Evanston, Illinois, Cameron Davis, Vice President of GEI Consultants, who served as U.S. President Obama's Great Lakes SAR for nearly a decade. And all in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. Kelsey Leonard, Canada Research Chair and Assistant Professor at the University of Waterloo, and a member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board. Environmental lawyer Mark Matson, who is President and CEO of Swim, Drink, Fish, and Mark Fisher, President and CEO of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, which TVO is proud to partner with this year to examine the state of the lakes. He's also a member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board. Welcome to you all.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so let's get us started. A question to all of you. I'm going to start with Mark Matson here. What would you say to folks who think the Great Lakes are just for swimming and recreation?
Well, that's a good question. I think, first of all, I'd send them a membership for Swim, Drink, Fish because we want people to think the Great Lakes are swimmable and fishable for sure. But obviously, the Great Lakes are much more than that. They're the world's greatest freshwater ecosystem. They're the drinking water for 40 million. And I know Mark Fisher and others can go on. And there's such an important cultural component to our Indigenous communities across the U.S. and Canada. So, I would say to them, it's a good start, but and don't ever accept no swimming and no fishing signs on your Great Lakes. They should be clean enough for humans as well as wildlife, but there's so much more to discover, and it is a lifelong journey of discovery. And I really, I believe there's just it's the connection to the Great Lakes grows over time, and that more we connect to the Great Lakes, the more we protect and restore them.
All right, Cam, I'm going to come to you with the same question. What do you say to those folks?
Yeah, there's a lot more to the Great Lakes than just fishing and swimming. In order for those things to happen, we need to have ecological integrity. It's like saying, you want to be able to use your car, but if you don't service it, if you don't get the oil changed, if you don't engage in upkeep of your car, you're not going to be able to drive it. So fishing and swimming are kind of surface uses that we think of, and they're amazing uses. I know I fell in love with the Great Lakes with my family, when I was a kid, going to beaches every other weekend when it was warm enough, of course. But if we do want to keep doing that, if we want to keep swimming, if we want to keep drinking the water, if we want the Great Lakes to provide jobs for our people, then we need to make sure that they're maintained, just like a home, just like any other kind of thing that we care about.
Kelsey, same question to you.
Wonderful. Yes. I think it's really important to recognize that the lakes themselves are living beings, they're living entities. And so that in and of itself, they have an inherent right to exist and to thrive, and to not solely be seen as something for human utility and human benefit and use. That's great that is oftentimes how we form a connection with the lakes, is through swimming or drinking or fishing, but they are so much more than that. And then when we also think about planetary healing and planetary well-being, they are vital to Earth's life support systems. So when we think about our current climate crisis, the health of the lakes, or the lack of health of the lakes, is directly linked to the climate impacts that we see every day in our communities.
All right, Mark Fisher.
Yeah, great question. So obviously when I think about the Great Lakes, fishing and swimming is incredibly important. But when we look at the health overall, I would argue that while we've made improvements to the health of the Great Lakes, we've restored, I think, some legacy challenges that we face because of industrialization. The Great Lakes themselves are still under tremendous pressure, particularly those lower Great Lakes like Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Michigan. We still see significant issues in terms of, combined sewer overflows and excess nutrients finding their way into the system because of rainfall, but also because of different agricultural practices. We're still seeing the introduction of aquatic invasive species, new emerging issues such as the introduction of pharmaceuticals and other chemicals into our bodies of water, plastic waste, plastic litter. So we've come a long way in addressing, I think, a lot of legacy issues, but there are so many new and emerging issues on the horizon that really challenge the health of the Great Lakes. And In fact, the latest State of the Great Lakes report that just came out assessed overall the health of the Great Lakes as fair and unchanging. And I don't think that that's anything to really be proud of as a Canadian or as Americans who share this globally significant natural resource, between both countries. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. And if we get the health of the Great Lakes right, there's a significant economy around this region that can flourish and obviously be more successful and more competitive, as Cam was indicating. We've got a very rich marine commerce industry here that supports over 200,000 jobs, $100 million worth of cargo, floats on the lakes every year. We use our water for hydropower, for fueling our industries, but a lot of that can't happen unless we're treating our lakes properly.
All right, Mark Fisher, I'm going to stick with you here for this question. You talked a lot about some of the issues there. A lot of issues require a lot of money. Earlier this year, the Biden administration announced over $100 million US in funding for Great Lakes restoration. That was a project sort of closer in the Minnesota area. Are the US and Canada making similar levels of investment in the lakes?
No, I think Canada is unfortunately being eclipsed. It's being outpaced by our American partners, and that has been happening more and more over the last decade. Right now, Canada more or less spends roughly $9 million a year in terms of its Great Lakes protection funding, community grants to support different projects. They're making some important investments in restoring areas of concern that are on the Canadian side of the border. But the funding has just been a real disappointment, I think, to me and a lot of Canadians. We're falling behind on science. We're falling behind on restoration. I think we're just falling behind in just really trying to understand and care for this globally significant ecosystem. And I know that Cam can speak about the experience on the U.S. side much more than I can and why it's been so successful.
Well, that's who I'm going to next. Cam, I don't want to single you out, but I'm going to single you out. Are your neighbors to the north dropping the ball on this?
Yeah. Yes, they are. Canada, the Canadian federal government is dropping the ball, and they're dropping it they're fumbling the ball even. And I don't say that to not acknowledge all of the ways in which the Canadian federal government has played a leadership role in many instances, going way beyond what we in the U.S. have ever done. But in this instance, one way that we can restore and protect the Great Lakes, we have to, is by making a financial commitment to that. Without the investment, without the money, all of the other things are just kind of words. And here in the U.S., we're up now past $500 million US. And what you just heard from Mark Fisher is that Canada is at about 9 million Canadian. That is a world of difference, and it means a lot. It makes a big difference when investments are so lopsided. So we need Canada to catch up, and to catch up fast.
All right, Mark Matson, I want to get your take on that as well in terms of where Canada stands with the level of investments. Are we dropping the ball on this?
Well, I agree with Mark and Cam on that. I mean, Canada hasn't been stepping up and really living up to its reputation as the greatest defender of the Great Lakes. No other country can really claim that. I mean, the United States, with the 8 states involved, there's a lot of different political jurisdictions. But in Canada, our federal government and fresh water, we have such a global reservoir of fresh water, and the Great Lakes, 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Canada needs to step up, and money's a big part of that. We have all kinds of projects, restoration projects that haven't been finished, and new projects, community initiatives that need to be led in order to collect the data to do the work to protect it going forward. So I think Canada's getting the sense now that they need to address the Great Lakes issues more than they ever have in the past, and I think I really think we're going to see some changes in the future. But right now, I don't know if it's been the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but it certainly seems like Canada has not stepped up to the plate for the Great Lakes financing and investments.
Kelsey, I see you nodding. I want to get you to weigh in on that as well.
Yes, I agree with everything that my panelists have shared so far. We really do need more investment from the Canadian government, particularly for First Nations as well. We see that, of those dollars, the community grants that were mentioned earlier, they often significantly go towards non-Indigenous governments, so to municipalities, to provinces, but we're not really seeing there be an equal distribution or a comparable distribution to First Nation governments in the same way that we see access to those similar types of financial resources on the US side through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So there is a substantial amount more resources available for tribal nations than there are for First Nations in working to protect the lakes, of which they are usually those on the front lines facing the direct impact when the lakes are degraded or polluted. So really just wanting to see more investment overall from Canada to make up for that.
Kelsey, I want to stick with you here. How can we say that Canada is concerned about the lakes with the level of financial commitment, which we seem to unanimously say is not enough, than we're seeing? How can we say that we are so concerned when the dollars don't match up?
I don't know that we can. That's probably a very easy answer. I don't know that we can say that Canada is concerned. I think that it is now, hopefully, through these conversations, will become more apparent to both the federal and provincial governments that they need to put more resources towards science, towards restoration, towards conservation efforts for the lakes, and in particular that there need to be opportunities for collaboration, partnership, and often in some instances, maybe more so than not, direct-led Indigenous conservation efforts for the lakes. We have millennia of knowledge and applied science in these spaces and territories. And so why not get a higher return on your investment by putting those dollars with people who know what to do with them?
Mark Fisher, same question to you in terms of, it must be frustrating in terms of the amount of advocating, the amount of pressure that you guys are putting on political government to get stuff done, but the dollars aren't saying much. And I am curious in terms of how this money is being spent. Where exactly are we seeing it go?
Well, it is disappointing. I think in terms of my advocacy, I often remind both the federal government and the Ontario government that 1 in 3 Canadians live in the Great Lakes Basin. 40% of Canada's economic activity is based here. They call the Great Lakes region home. And so, focusing on the Great Lakes, focusing on this region is, makes good ecological sense. It's also good economic sense. And for the life of me, I don't understand why we don't have a more robust strategy, robust approach when we think about how do we improve this region's long-term economic success and sustainability. When it comes to the funding right now, some of it is going to science, which we need to be doing a heck of a lot more of to understand those emerging challenges I talked about earlier, including a rapidly changing climate. And it's going to these community grants and these community projects that are doing important restoration work and projects around the Great Lakes coastline, but we're just not doing enough in terms of the sheer scope and scale that it needs to be done on to truly protect the Great Lakes region, whether it's nature and biodiversity or, making sure our beaches are clean. All of that community work and that citizen science is being supported by these very limited grants that are available. So, and obviously we're doing a little bit around, cleaning up areas of concern, but these areas of concerns have been around since the 1980s. And it's now that now it's time to start delisting these areas of concern and really giving back to these communities that have had these industrial hotspots and reimagining what these places are going to be like for the future and really leveraging that investment and turning them into livable spaces.
Mark Matson, I'm going to come to you. Canada has invested in the Great Lakes, but more money is always needed. Talk to us a little bit about how some of that money gets used with your organization, Swim Drink Fish.
Sure, and Mark just touched on it. We've been doing a lot of community initiatives, community engagement around water quality monitoring, community-based water quality monitoring. We've worked with Zibasing First Nation, some other First Nations organizations as well, so that they can also collect the data that we need. And there's traditional ecological knowledge, but we do a lot of the science stuff, Western science, and collect one of the things we collect is bacteria and E. coli. And so we can publish that data every day so the public knows if the water's swimmable. It's a big question. It's the number one question we get at Swim Drink Fish is, can I swim in Lake Ontario? Can I swim in the Great Lakes? And so that's easy. I mean, government needs to invest in that. If they don't want to do the work, they need to get the communities out there, because those answers are easy to discover on a regular basis and a daily basis. But beyond that, there's so many other groups out there. I know DataStream, Water Rangers, community initiatives that are being led at the grassroots to get the community involved and the volunteers and get the data and the science that our scientists and our government and our politicians need to make much bigger decisions about where they're going to invest money. So I'm excited that they're investing in community monitoring. I think they need to expand it. And I also just think, just really quickly, we need champions. The Indigenous communities have been champions of the Great Lakes. But I look to, our governments, and I fail to see the same sort of champions for the Great Lakes. I don't see who's out there talking about the Great Lakes at the United Nations, who's out there talking about the Great Lakes in New York or in Washington. Who is our champion that's really going to talk about it as the greatest, freshwater ecosystem in the world? And I think there's a lot we can learn from these communities, particularly the Indigenous communities, about the importance of the Great Lakes and how to talk about them globally, so that the funds that Canadians are using to protect the Great Lakes are really invested in the right people and in the right projects. And I'm excited about it going forward, but there's so much work on that, and we need that advocate politically to really champion the Great Lakes at home and around the world.
I want to stick with you, Mark Matson, on a question sort of regarding the funding. How much of it has to do with, that the lakes on the Canadian side are actually really in one province? And that's not necessarily the case on the American side. Does that have something to do with it?
A little bit. I just want to say just two provinces, of course, Quebec.
Right.
I think over 80% of Quebecers get their drinking water from the St. Lawrence. So, it's just a connection to the Great Lakes, that fresh water. So it's, we're linked, we're linked, Quebec and Ontario, to the Great Lakes in really important ways. But you're exactly right. There's so much bifurcation and political division on the Great Lakes. It's hard to take credit for the whole Great Lakes. There's 8 states. There's Ohio, there's New York, Wisconsin, Illinois, there's Minnesota. Pennsylvania. These states have to work with Ontario, which is why we have the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, why the IJC set up these panels and these groups and these agreements. And we know that we need to bring Indigenous communities across the lakes into those agreements, because they have so much to contribute to the future of the Great Lakes. But those agreements, Ontario, we're always feeling like we're just a part of it, whereas I think they need to step up and say, no, this is the agreement that affects almost everyone in Ontario. It's our drinking water, and Quebec, and that, this is a really important part of who we are as Canadians. No matter where you live, the Great Lakes is a place that Canadians need to stand up for. Let me just put it that way.
All right. Well, I'm going to get Cam in there as well. In terms of the concerning amounts of financial commitment, does that also have to do with sort of, the number of cities that are sort of on the shorelines of the Great Lakes there?
Yeah, I sometimes find that and I say this as a local elected official myself. We like to play hot potato with who's responsible. And so, one thing that I think is important to remember is we need all of these jurisdictions at the table. We need a strong Canadian federal investment. We need the provincial investments, just like the states need to be at the table for investments, municipalities as well. And when you start to hear, we don't put as much money into restoring and protecting the Great Lakes because after a while, it starts to sound like an excuse. And there is no excuse. All of the jurisdictions need to be weighing in using our tax money, So we're funding it as citizens and in both Canada and the US. We're saying we want you to spend our money on this. We want you, our governments, to represent us by investing in this way. And the other thing I'll say, Jan, is we tend to think about the work that needs to be done for right now. I want to swim this year with my kids. I want to fish this year with my friends. But these investments have to do far more than this. We have to bring our indigenous friends and allies to the table a lot more than we've done, but we also have to be looking way into the future, much more than we've ever done. And we have the data to be able to do that, to do forecasting, to make sure that we're restoring and protecting the Great Lakes, not just for this year and next year or the next 5 years, but for the next 500 years, the next 1,000 years. We need to do that because the Great Lakes system is changing. And if we don't make these investments in a future-sighted way, the Great Lakes are not going to be able to support us. And that's my biggest concern.
All right, let's talk about some of the political players here. Mark Fisher, I'm going to come to you. Obviously, you are there for the Great Lakes Public Forum. Will both the federal and the Ontario ministers, environment ministers, attend the forum?
I believe the federal minister is attending this week. I don't believe the Ontario minister is attending due to schedule conflicts, but this is a big event. I think there should be representation federally from the Ontario and Quebec, from each of the 8 Great Lakes states at a highest level. Obviously citizens need to be here, NGOs, academia, industry. It needs to be a much bigger and well-attended event than it is, particularly from a policy and political standpoint.
Kelsey, as Cam had mentioned, there is no excuse, and I want to get your take on what kind of message does that send, that their absence at this forum?
Well, I think their absence indicates the level of commitment and value system that they have towards the lakes. I think to what Mark Fisher said earlier, this is a massive event and commemoration in recognition of 50 years since the signing of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And it would have been wonderful to see heads of state here, to see the Prime Minister, to see the President of the United States here and valuing this and this massive ecological system that's important to our overall climate well-being. We just finished the New York Climate Week at the UN General Assembly this past week. What better way than to have these heads of state come here, commemorate it, and also make a commitment to reimagining the transnational and international agreements that we have for stewardship of the lakes. And what I mean by that is to actually have made a commitment during this public forum for the inclusion of Indigenous nations, both tribal nations, First Nations, and Métis, to be signatories of a revised and reimagined agreement for the next 50 years. Unfortunately, that didn't happen.
All right, so a question to all of you. I want to hear some specific actions you'd like to see taken by, when we talk about all government levels, federal, provincial, municipal, to protect the lake. I want to start with Mark Madsen.
Well, thanks. And just, what happened today in Niagara-on-the-Lake, like the leadership that did show up, and it's one of the important things we need to going forward is governance, and including the Indigenous leaders from around the Great Lakes on that governance and those agreements. And what happened today at the Great Lakes is, some of the most, the highest serving, most respected Indigenous leaders came to Niagara-on-the-Lake today and did a water ceremony, to welcome the public to the Great Lakes Public Forum in the 50th anniversary. They also, talked about the different wampum belts and did a dedication of a canoe as part of sort of a reminder of reconciliation in the history of the Great Lakes. And we have incredible leaders from the Indigenous community who are coming this week, who came today. And what makes me sad and disappointed is that many of the other leaders, provincially, federally, across the U.S., New York, the 8 states, they're not here. And, President Biden and our Prime Minister Trudeau aren't here. And it's the 50th anniversary of the signing of Richard Nixon and Pierre Elliott Trudeau. They saw how important it was in 1972. And we've had a few agreements changed a bit in 78, 87, and 2012. But this is a really important time. 50 years ago, we set out to restore the Great Lakes, and here we are looking to the next 50 years, which are probably more important. We've made some progress, but everybody here would agree the decisions for today moving forward are so important. So we need to invest in better governance, and we need to get our politicians' attention, including the Indigenous communities in those agreements. We need more investment We've all agreed on that today. And I think for our organization and for a lot of other groups, it's getting the community involved. It's getting people connected to the Great Lakes, getting them into the water's edge, teaching them about how important the Great Lakes are to all of us, because the more they're connected, the more they're going to protect and restore and love these Great Lakes. And I think those, that's where the funding needs to go, into governance, into keeping the waste out of the Great Lakes, investments in keeping toxins out, and third, in building collaboration across the Great Lakes so we continue to work together. Because no one state or province or country can protect the Great Lakes or Indigenous community. We have to work together. It's a shared responsibility.
Before I get to Kelsey on her take there, I do want to show, we do actually have a photo of that moment that you were just talking about between President Richard Nixon and Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, shaking hands right after the signing. Obviously a big moment. Of course, Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister, and President Biden won't be making an appearance at the public forum. But Kelsey, I want to come to you. If you had the table to talk to all levels of government, what would you be asking for?
Oh, that's a big question. Everything. I think in terms of but to be more realistic and targeted and strategic with our approach. One, as I mentioned earlier, is a reimagination of these treaty agreements, and particularly of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Indigenous nations were purposely excluded from the original agreement. We've seen amendments to the agreement that have allowed for more engagement of Indigenous nations across the two nation states. However, that still does not amount to signatory as a named party. And so that really is where we need to go in the future. As others have mentioned on the panel today, if we want to, protect the Great Lakes for the next 100 to 500 years, we need to ensure that Indigenous nations are signatory parties to whatever that protocol and processes may look like moving forward for the lake's protection. In addition to that, we've talked a little bit about how Canada is at a deficit in terms of their investment, largely financial. But I want to just note one area in terms of political investment and redistribution of power that has been really impactful on the Canadian side, which is the appointment of Dr. Henry Lickers as a commissioner to the IJC, one of our first Indigenous commissioners to hold that post. And so I think it's really important, at least on the U.S. side, that we see that same level of commitment in the future moving forward, that there is a commissioner appointed from a tribal nation. I also think it would be really great that at some point through a reimagining of these agreements, these transboundary agreements, that we see a reimagining of the commissioners, and that there actually are dedicated appointments for tribal nations, First Nations, and Métis, so that we really do have a more equitable process, and a process by which parity can be ascribed across decision making. And then resources and money. So those would be my three things.
All right, Cam, I'll get you in on there.
Sure. I think of these things in terms of the three P's. One is policy. We need stronger policies that are prevention oriented to make sure that damage isn't happening to the Great Lakes in the first place. So many times, if you look back at the history of the Great Lakes, at least modern history of advocacy, a problem happens, we react, we try to fix it. It takes decades. That dynamic has got to flip on its head. We have to identify our problems long before they occur and get in front of them. So policy is one of the P's. People is another P. We need the right leaders at the table, and you heard a little bit about that from Kelsey. Could not agree more that it's time for our First Nations, tribal leaders, Métis, to be very strongly in the mix of the policies that we're creating. And then I always have a hard time finding a word that starts with P for money and investments. So I go back to my law school days, and I remember the word pecuniary. But that's the other P. We need the funding, enough of the deferred maintenance on the Great Lakes. We cannot keep setting aside and pushing down the road our obligations to help make sure that the Great Lakes are supported and functioning. Because if we keep doing that, the Great Lakes will not support us. They will not continue to act, serve, and function like they need to as the healthy living organisms that they really are. And we have to be doing this in a far-sighted way. We have to be making decisions, for the next 500 years or so. Those are the 3 Ps that I think are the key ingredients to making sure that the Great Lakes are going to be around for my kids and their kids and their kids and their kids and so on.
Mark Fisher, I'm going to ask you a different question here. Cam talked about support. I'm going to talk about the other type of support. In the 1970s, we had Earth Day, the Canada Water Act, and then, of course, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, all in the 70s here, all due to a large, massive public outcry that we needed a more cleaner environment. Can we galvanize the public to move the needle even further on this conversation this time around, too?
We have to. I don't think we have a choice. I was doing some rough math this morning, and of Ontario's 124 electoral ridings, close to 50% of them share the part of the Great Lakes coastline. These ridings are hugely important to these communities, not only in terms of getting out and experiencing natural spaces in the environment, but also how these lakes support those local economies. So we absolutely have to find a way of connecting and re-engaging with our citizenry around just how important the Great Lakes economy, the Great Lakes environment is to Ontario and to the broader region. And their voice is critical right now. My advice is that everybody in Ontario needs to be writing their local member of parliament, their member of provincial parliament, and asking them to step up in terms of the policies and the fundings that Cam talked about. Right now, we're trying to get the government to firmly commit to the $1 billion commitment for the Freshwater Action Plan that was in the last campaign. It's time to do that. And I think if we can, this region will be positioned, for the long term, that, as Cam had indicated, in terms of getting the economy right, but getting the sustainable development and growth of this region right. And so citizens have to be front and center in that conversation, and they're just not now. It's unfortunate I can't go through my itemized list of my wants because I have many. But getting citizens engaged in this conversation is critical right now.
Mark Matson, I'm going to come to you. Same question. How do we move that needle?
Well, I agree with everything said, but it's citizens. I mean, this is why we're here. Many of us at the Great Lakes Public Forum, and in 2012 they included the public and citizens in the Great Lakes Water Quality Board. And I really think the more we connect people again to the Great Lakes right across the board and take pride in the Great Lakes, that the politicians will respond. I mean, I always think of the Great Lakes as being the most important political, center in North America. I don't think you can get elected as the president of the United States without the 8 blue states. And certainly in Canada, when you take Quebec and Ontario, their most important natural infrastructure is the Great Lakes and the drinking water. So I think the more we understand it, the more we talk about it, the more we work together, the more the politicians are going to begin to respond in an effective way with money, sharing governance, and really for me too, it's science. It's about, we know so little about the Great Lakes, and getting the community to collect data and have that data so the public get real answers about, can I drink that water? Can I go swimming there? What's happening to our ecosystem? What about those birds who can't read the no swimming, no drinking signs? How are they doing? We need that science and that level of science. So I'm excited, but I think it all starts with community and people, and they're the hope for sure for the future of the Great Lakes, so that our politicians will smarten up.
Kelsey, I'm going to come to you. We talk about the citizens and the people. Is there this perception that people don't care about the Great Lakes or don't care enough about the Great Lakes, and why?
Well, I personally don't have that perception. I think it's largely because of the wonderful work that we've been able to do through the Great Lakes Water Quality Board and through our Great Lakes Regional Poll. So this is a public opinion poll we've run for 3 iterations now, 2015, 2018, and 2021. And we survey over 3,000 residents of the Great Lakes by a phone survey. And then more recently this year, we also added in an online survey. So we have a really, really good database and data set of respondents. And overwhelmingly, every sort of iteration of the poll, well over 90% of respondents say that they love the lakes, that they are, wanting to see that they are protected and cared for, and that we have policies in place that protect them for the future, not only for their own individual futures, but for future generations. And so I think that if that myth exists, we are hoping to debunk it. Right now, citizens care, as my co-panelists have shared. They care a whole lot about the lakes. What we need to see is the action of politicians and government responding to that data from the polls that we've created to recognize that their constituents value this investment, and so they should be investing in these issues of concern.
Cam, as the only American on this panel, I'm going to give you the last word here in terms of what we can be doing to sort of move that needle with the public and get them to care.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it starts with helping people understand what needs to be done. We need to punch the accelerator and get our toxic hotspots cleaned up. We need to make sure that our coasts are resilient to be able to withstand the pounding that they are starting to take under lots of different climate change scenarios. We need to make sure that we are safeguarding areas around the Great Lakes that have a high degree of ecological integrity and that might be in jeopardy. We need to make sure that people understand the connection to why it really affects them to care about the Great Lakes. I'm with Kelsey on this. I have yet to meet anybody who doesn't care about the Great Lakes, who doesn't want to see them protected and restored. What I sometimes see and hear is that people don't quite know how to do that. But the electoral process is a key part of it, making sure that we are electing and re-electing leaders who understand that this is not a partisan issue. People of all stripes want to be able to take their kids to the beach. They want to be able to drink their water. They want a Great Lakes that are healthy for the next 7 generations. And I say that wearing a whole bunch of different hats, whether it's at GEI, my elected position at the Water Reclamation District in Chicago, and formerly with the Obama administration. These are the kinds of observations I've had and noticed in almost 40 years of doing this work.
Cam, Kelsey, Mark, and Mark, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.